Johann Kotze's lawyers have portrayed the so-called Modimolle Monster as a man driven mad by love. They say he believed that he and his estranged wife, Ina Bonnet, would get back together, and was deeply disturbed when, during his elaborate stalking of Bonnet, he saw her with another man on New Year's Eve. Kotze's lawyers say he didn't eat or sleep for 3 days after witnessing this sight.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me again today. Last week we spoke about the Stellar murders, and if you haven't seen that, I will link it somewhere up here for you. So today we're going to talk about the Modimolle Monster, and this was a suggestion from one of my subscribers. Thank you very much. So like I said, we're going to talk about the Modimolle Monster, who is also known as Johann Kotze. So we are trying out something new today, as you can see by this. Let me know what you think of it down below. So before we get into the story, I do just want to give a warning that the story is quite graphic, so I will give a timestamp of where you can skip later on in the story, and I also will try and keep the graphics to a minimum.
Intended for mature audiences only.
So in Rustenburg, South Africa, which is around a 2-hour drive away from Johannesburg, South Africa, Lavina Swanepoel was born in 1969, was born to a working class family, and they all lived on a farm within the area. So she had quite a rural upbringing. But for Lavina, this is not what she wanted. She wanted the glitz and the glams of what Johannesburg could bring. And for the rest of the story, yes, her name is Lavina Swanepoel, but she mostly referred to herself as Ina, so I will call her Ina throughout the rest of the story. So anyway, back to Ina and her life goals. She wanted to live a nice, beautiful, luxurious life, and she thought that Johannesburg could bring this. So when Ina was around 19, 20 years old, she did exactly what she wanted to do. She moved to Johannesburg and she worked as a secretary. And in her dreams, a secretarial job, wearing high heels, walking around the office every day, was goals. This is exactly what she wanted to do. Not soon after she arrived and she worked for the Department of Home Affairs within South Africa, she left. She only lasted a couple months within the department and she moved back to her rural farm in Rustenburg. Now in my head, I have no idea why I got this image, but I got the image of the series on Cakenet, I think it is, here in South Africa, where it's Boer soek 'n vrou, or Farmer Wants a Wife in English as well. But that is the image that I got for the first time that Rex and Ina met. They kind of had a very whirlwind relationship. They kind of fell in love almost first time that they saw each other. And Rex Bonnet and Ina Swanepoel met when she was 21 years old, and they actually got married in the same year. And the couple lived very happily within Rustenburg. They ended up having 2 children together. The firstborn was a boy named Conrad. The secondborn was a girl named Angelique. So sadly, this fairy tale between Rex and Ina came to an end because in 2004, Ina heard that Rex had been unfaithful to her. And obviously, Ina was horrified and really upset by this. So she ended up asking Rex to move out and for them to get a divorce. And during the entire marriage, Ina and Rex relied heavily on each other. So Rex would rely on Ina for certain things and Ina would rely on Rex for certain things. And I think Ina relied sometimes on Rex for money, so she didn't really have her own independence and her own things. She decided that because Rex is done and he did all these horrible things to her, she was no longer going to want to need anybody. So by building herself up step by step by step, she became an extremely successful businesswoman. She ran basically, I think, an insurance company with other people, but she was like a head of a division within the insurance company. So she was pretty high up within this company. She kept getting calls from this guy, and I think that's how they met, but basically this man called Johann Kotze kept calling her. And this was around August 2009. So Ina, after being like pestered by this Johann, eventually decided to maybe chat to each other outside of work. Why, we don't know, but they started chatting and they were basically like loved up teenagers. They were talking till late at night. They were like flirting on the phone, giggling, all those kind of things. But Ina was a smart cookie, and she made sure that when Johann actually wanted to meet up with Ina, that she made sure that they were in a public place. She was not going to go to some strange guy's house or meet in the middle of nowhere. So they did end up meeting a few weeks or months after they first started chatting. And they met at the most random place, but it was an engine garage, which fair enough, you cannot get any more public than an engine garage. So remember that I said that Ina lived in Rustenburg, kind of near Johannesburg. So basically, Ina lived Rustenburg and Johann stayed in Bloemfontein. And that is a very far distance relationship here in South Africa. It's around a 7-hour drive, 6.5-hour drive. And Johann, because he was so loved up with Ina, he would travel every single weekend from Bloemfontein to Rustenburg, like the 6.5-hour drive. And when Johann would visit Ina, he would give her gifts, expensive gifts, mind you. And he would also be very, very attentive. So whenever Ina needed anything, he would be like, no, I got it. I'll go get you coffee. I'll go get you something to eat. Just sit your pretty face down, basically, is what the vibe I'm getting. Then Johann and Ina eventually introduced each other to their friends, their family. And Johann's friends, like, loved Ina. But she was always weirded out that he only had like 1 or 2. There wasn't an abundance of close friends. And I mean, that's nothing really to be worried about. People, when they grow older, they have a certain number of real friends that they have, which is fine. But when Ina introduced Johann to her friends, they liked him. They thought that he was sweet, he was kind, and he was very nurturing towards her. But they did notice that when Johann thought that no one was listening, he would give Ina really weirdly rude digs at her. And he would make them uncomfortable as well, because he would do it in public where he thought people weren't listening, but obviously they were. And these digs would range from anything about her appearance to be like, oh, your hair smells, you smell, why is your lipstick looking like that? Or like while they were at a party, he would like whisper to Ina and be like, nah. That kind of thing. So then after they just met, they would go to parties and the friends would notice these kind of digs, right? But the more the friends started hanging out, Ina would describe to her friends how he would really, really dig at her appearance like hectically. He started out with Ina's hair and said that he preferred girls with short hair. And Ina's long hair, which she loved, by the way, was looking unkept, untidy, and she needs to sort that out like yesterday already. Johann would also kind of creep, and I get that they lived so far, they struggled to be intimate, I guess, during the week, and they wanted to spice up their relationship, I assume. Johann would ask Ina every week, basically, to send pictures of her breasts, specifically to him. He was obsessed with her breasts. But Nina was like, no, thank you, I'm not really into that nude game. And she hated the thought of having to send nudes to Johann. She was like, but what if the phone gets stolen? Then everyone has my nudes. You could send it to anybody that you like. I just don't like the feeling of you having nudes of me. And Johann kept on persisting. He was like, please, you have to. We're in a relationship. This is what people do. This is how the world is turning, you know. It's not the same as your old relationship where you just had to show your husband in the bedroom. Now I want to see everything. But because Johann was so persistent, she eventually relented and she sent Johann some nudes, like basically just of her breasts and her body. I don't think she sent of her face, but I could be wrong. So remember when I spoke before, Ina and Johann had introduced everyone in terms of their friend group. But Johann was persistent and like obsessed enough to introduce everybody they met to Ina. So like if Johann and Ina were in the street, he would go and say, this is my girlfriend. Yeah, this is my girlfriend. Like that kind of obsessive. And weirdly enough, whenever Ina had to go into work, maybe on the weekend quickly, Johann would go with her to work and then he would parade around the office and say, oh, you know, Ina's my girlfriend. Yeah, so don't talk to her, she's my girlfriend, hey? And because Johann thought that he was so close to Ina's work colleagues, he thought that he could ask all of them to lie to Ina because he had a surprise for her. So one day he asked all of the colleagues to message and email Ina to ask if she could come in because they have an emergency at the event that they were running that weekend. So Ina was like, oh, fine, let's go in. And Johann said that he was busy running an errand, so he wasn't with Ina at the time. But when Ina got into the office, she walked into the doors of their building and she noticed that all of her colleagues were staring at her and Johann was also in this crowd. And he went down on one knee and proposed to Ina. Now, they were only dating for like a couple months. It hadn't even been a year yet when he proposed. And Ina did say yes, by the way. So the couple was engaged, and I will talk about their disaster of a wedding in a moment. But I kind of want to talk more about Johann and who he was because I haven't got into that yet. So Johannes Christian Kotze was born in Namibia, and that was in 1961. Back then in the 60s, I think there may have been quite a stigma about children that were born out of wedlock. So if you were a bastard child and you were born from parents that weren't married, you were the epitome of disgust. Like, how dare you be a dirty child and be born out of wedlock? Not that it's a child's fault, but... So Johann was born out of wedlock and he carried the stigma throughout his childhood. And sadly, just after Johann was born, his mother and father did not want him because they did not want to be branded as having this bastard child. So they kind of left Johann at the hospital and literally just abandoned him, walked out of the hospital. So Johann stayed with his neighbor for around 3 years until unfortunately she passed away. Thankfully she did take him in for his younger years, but because she had passed away, Johann's father was now really stuck because he didn't have anywhere to go. So Johann's father was like, fine, I'll take him in. And I think mostly the pressure was coming from Johann's fiance at the time, because he was just about to get married when Johann was taken in by his biological father. And during Johann's father's marriage, his stepmother did end up having children with his father. So Johann did have half sisters. And apparently Johann and his half-sisters were very, very close. They got on really well and they would always play together, and they were a very close, like, sibling group. But their sisters did say that Johann was constantly tormented at school for being born out of wedlock, and he was constantly bullied and hit, and just people were very horrible to him in school. So now that we know a little bit about both couples and the background, let's kind of get back to the wedding. So like I said, 8 months after Johann and Ina had just begun dating, Johann asked her to marry him, and they did. They had their reception at a church, and then they wanted to have their food and stuff outside in the garden. But sadly, on that day that they had everything planned, it started pouring with rain, so they had to have their celebrations in the same place that their reception was. But the church and everything wasn't really geared up to have a party, and you have all the pews and it's just awkward, so people were kind of cramped in there, and people didn't end up staying very long at the church. The guests ended up leaving quite early, and Johann and Ina decided to go back up to the room where they were staying for the night to celebrate their marriage. But now, not even 5 minutes after Ina and Johann got into the bedroom, Johann sits Ina down on the bed and says to her, so listen, there are some rules that are going to happen now in our marriage, and I'm going to list them for you now. Johann literally had the commandments that he thought would make a perfect marriage, and these are apparently the commandments that he expected from Ina. 1. The marriage would be really successful if Ina just listened to everything that Johann said. She would no longer be able to go out without Johann's permission. Ina's parents would have to ask permission and book an appointment with Johann in order for them to come over to the house. Ina's children would have to ask Johann for permission before they could do anything. If they wanted to snack out the cupboard, don't ask mom, go ask Johann. If they wanted to go out with friends, don't ask mom, ask Johann. Johann said that she looked way too skinny, she needs to put on weight, and she needs to wear black jeans only, because he only liked black jeans. I know, right? He sounds lovely. So Ina and Johann moved into Ina's actual house because Johann had no money on his name. He said that his money was being tied up in some farm that he had in Bloemfontein, and there was money issues with that farm. But when looking into this, he was actually renting the farm. He didn't own the farm in Bloemfontein where he was staying. And apparently the farm owners who actually owned the farm said that Johann was stealing cattle, because they gave Johann a farm with cattle on for him to run while he stayed on farm, and the cattle started disappearing. So Johann maybe owed bills and decided that he was going to sell the cattle off. I assume, I don't know, but he didn't own the farm basically in Bloemfontein. So when Johann and Ina moved in, it was all Ina's money that they had. So when Johann and Ina lived together, it wasn't really the fact that she constantly had to change her appearance to fit Johann's request. It was mostly the fact that Ina had to tell Johann everything. Wherever she was going, what she was doing, what she was eating, who was texting her, anything like that. But what really upset Ina was the fact that she had to report to Johann, but Johann would never reciprocate. Ina also felt very uncomfortable when Johann constantly had his cell phone, and whenever he would answer his cell phone, he would either turn it over when someone was calling, or he would walk out of the room and then answer his phone. Then one day when Johann was out on business, and I say it like this because she had no idea what he did or where he went during the day, because remember, she wasn't allowed to ask. But Johann called Ina and said to her, oh, by the way, I have leukemia and the insurance isn't going to pay for it, so I think you have to fork out the money for my leukemia. At first Ina was like, what are you talking about? You don't have leukemia, you haven't been sick at all. Then Johann said, yes, I have been, you just haven't been noticing, you've been a bad wife. And he said that he went to doctors secretly, and that's why he knew and she didn't. Eventually, after Johann was done ranting and raving at her, he put the phone down, and Ina was standing there dumbfounded, and she was like, hold on a second, this is not believable. So she called the insurance and she called the doctor and said, listen, does my husband actually have leukemia? And the insurance had never had any claims from Johann. And the doctor that they went to, their GP, said that he's never heard anything either. And if you ever watch Catfish, is this not the number one scenario that people always use when catfishing? Oh, they have cancer, or they have leukemia, or there's someone else they know has cancer. So I'm getting real like Catfish vibes from Johann. So when Johann got back from his business trip, Ina said to Johann, you know what, I'm done with this dishonesty, you can like get out the house basically. And they broke up, and Ina said, get out of my house, go live in your own place. And Ina wanted a divorce. And by the way, this was only 5 months after Ina and Johann got married. This was around March 2011. But Johann was persistent. He kept on nagging, basically, Ina for months and months and months after they broke up. And he said, please, I really need you back. I'm so sorry. And Ina eventually took him back. But while Ina was busy moving into the flat that her and Johann owned together previously, she was going through some boxes in Johann's bedroom and noticed that he had like 5 cell phones in the bedroom. And Ina was like, that's suspicious. So she looked through the content of all the cell phones, and there was different text messages and nude pictures from 5 different women on these 5 different cell phones. So Ina was obviously upset by this, and she confronted Johann about this, and he said that it was actually evidence that he was keeping because he was laying sexual harassment charges on these women because they were sexually harassing him, constantly sending him nudes when he didn't even ask for them. And it seems that Ina may have believed him because she let this incident go. And while Ina and Johann were living together again, Ina decided to take her daughter to some show, and yes, she asked for Johann's permission, and they went to some show one night. And when Ina got back to the house, she noticed that every single thing had been sold while Johann was standing in the house. And apparently it was because Johann was upset that Ina did something. But how do you go and sell everything in the house over a weekend? Like from Friday to Saturday. But Ina was obviously pissed off by this. She literally had nothing else on her name anymore. And she got so upset with Johann that she decided to swear at him and slap him in the face. And she eventually moved out. And Ina decided to move to a flat in Modimolle. So remember Ina's ex-husband Rex? Well, they had a son and daughter together, remember? And Conrad would stay with his mother, but it was mostly Angelique that stayed with Ina. But Conrad would move between his dad's flat and his mom's flat. But Johann would not leave Ina alone. He was constantly trying to find out where she was. And sadly, he eventually did find out where she lived. And because of this, he would not stop going to her house. He would knock on her door every single day. He would phone her over 100 times within like a certain period of time. And remember, Ina was the one with money. So when Ina moved out and stopped paying for this flat that she and Johann were renting, Johann had nowhere to go. So he asked a mutual friend, well, it was mostly Johann's friend, but this person did know both Ina and Johann. And Johann decided to ask this guy, listen, do you have a place to stay? I know you have like a B&B. Is there any possibility that I could stay there and rent the B&B from you? And at the time, the landlord was like, I kind of have someone living there, so you need to go somewhere else. But surprisingly, the B&B then became available and he was able to move in soon afterwards. And this flat was also in Modimolle, where Ina was staying. So Johann was refusing to sign the divorce papers that Ina wanted, obviously because she doesn't want to be with Johann anymore. And Johann refused to sign them. And he was dragging it out. He was constantly making excuses. So when Johann Kotze actually did contact her on the 3rd of February 2012, Ina actually thought that he was maybe contacting her to get on with the divorce. And finally, he maybe came to his senses. So Johann and Ina decided to meet at Johann's B&B at around 2:30 in the afternoon on the 3rd of January 2012. So before Ina happened to come to the house on the day that they wanted to meet, Johann left his house to go to a garage to pick up some guys to do some gardening for him. There were 3 men. One was named Andriy Sitole, who he mostly kept in contact with because he was like the main guy of these gardeners, so he arranged for other gardeners to meet up that day. So like I said, the main guy was Andriy Sitole. There was another guy named Peter Molake, and the 3rd guy was named Selo Mpaka. Now, Johann got into the car and he went to pick up these guys from the petrol station. So they all hopped into Johann's bakkie, and Johann then took them to the shops to get some food for them. He said, listen, grab whatever you want, have some lunch, and then after that we can go back to my house to do the garden. And when they arrived at Johann's house, they started with their gardening services and they started to clean up the garden. Now, let's get into the actual story. This is all based on Ina's story. So by 2:30 on the 3rd of January 2012, Ina arrived at Johann's house and they started to have conversation. They were talking about the divorce. They were talking about things that mattered, and Then all of a sudden the conversation turned, and Ina said that the conversation was going nowhere. They started bickering and Ina was just getting upset and she wanted to leave. But Johann stopped her from leaving. He kind of like pushed his body in between the doors so she couldn't leave. And Johann's excuse for why Ina couldn't leave is because he said, you know, in the bedroom, I still have something that belongs to you. So don't you want to fetch your belongings? I'm tired of having your stuff around the house. So Ina thought this was really weird because she never stayed with Johann in this house. So she went into the bedroom, but she was really cautious and weirded out by this. But she was curious. She maybe thought that Johann had taken something from when they still lived together and he was like creeping over it, and maybe she thought she would get something that she forgot that she had back from him. Now, like I said, I'm going to give a warning that this next part is going to be quite graphic. So I'm going to give a timestamp up here and you can skip to this time if you want to skip whatever I'm going to talk about next. So as Ina walked into the bedroom, she said that there was nothing on the bed but like a hand towel that was lying on the edge of the bed with a whole pile of coins. Like, I'm talking a lot of coins. You know when you save up a whole piggy bank and you have that many coins in your thing? It was like that much on the bed. And Johann was not really saying anything, and he walked towards the towel. He picked up the corner of the towel and he like flung the coins so they all scattered everywhere. And it was quite a loud noise because Johann stayed in a place that had wooden floors. So these coins made one hell of a noise when they hit the floor. Then as Ina was kind of looking at these coins rolling everywhere on the floor, Johann then took the towel and wrapped it around her face and threw her on the bed. Then she kind of like shook her head and the towel started coming off, and she saw 3 men with pantyhose over their face walk into the bedroom. Now, when Ina saw this, she obviously flipped her shit. She was scared shitless of these men coming into the bedroom. And excuse my language, but I would also be. Johann then shouted at Andries in Afrikaans and told him to tell the other guys to do what they needed to do with Ina. But first, Johann told them to duct tape Ina. And while Andries is trying to just duct tape like over her mouth, you can easily just like scrumple it and it comes off. So he decided that, okay, this is not working clearly. So Andries decided to take the duct tape completely around her face, where she only had a tiny slit like this to breathe from her nostril. While the men were looking at Ina with duct tape around her face, they said to her, we're going to sexually assault you, so I hope that you are going to be prepared for that. Johann then sat next to Ina while these men were telling her that and said, you were cheating on me, and this is kind of what you get for doing that. You deserve what you're going to get now. Ina had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Ina was in no relationships between the time that they were trying to get divorced. She literally did not want any man in her life right now while she was trying to get divorced from Johann. But during the attack, while these men were kind of like pulling Ina's clothes off, Johann stood next to her and said to her, quote, when I leave a woman, she either kills herself or she ends up in a mental institution, end quote. Now, this next part is where it gets graphic again, so I want to give another warning. If you want to skip, you can skip to here again. Now, what I'm going to tell you next is apparently what Johann did to Ina, and this is all from Ina's perspective. So Johann joined in pulling Ina's pants off, and he started to tear open her blouse where it revealed her breasts. And remember I said that Johann was obsessed with Ina's breasts. Now, Johann then walked to a cupboard where he kept his tools, and he took out a pair of pliers. He then put the pliers on Ina's nipple, and he twisted the pliers until her nipple actually broke off, and it was bleeding and gushing. Then he took his other fingernail and dug it into her other breast so that it would also bleed. He took scissors and he cut off her hair. He tried to bend back or like hurt her nails so that she couldn't scratch or anything. I'm not sure if he maybe tried to pull them off with pliers, but he did hurt her nails as well. So he cut all her hair off, and then he had the audacity to sexually assault her with the pliers and other objects within the room. Then after all of this, while she's literally bleeding and screaming, he then took a bucket of cold water and threw it on her body. He then instructed the 3 men to do what they wanted to do, and then they all took turns to sexually assault her. Then, horrifically, after everything had happened, the sexual assault had all happened, Johann happened to, remember I told you he worked on a farm with animals, and I don't know why he would carry it around, but basically it was that thing where if something happened to the cows or the cattle and say they would bleed, he would then either burn the bleed to stop it, or he would use like this solution that would also burn the bleed to stop it. And what he did was he did a mixture of these two and did that on Ina's wounds. How disturbed is this man to do it not only on her nipples but also in her private regions, and I cannot imagine the immense pain that Ina must have been in. Then Johann took Ina's phone while she was screaming on the bed, and he said that he was going to call Conrad, who remember was Ina's son, who was around 19 years old now at the time. And he said he was going to call her and make him come to the house so that he could force Conrad to have sex with his mother. And if he refused, according to Johann, he was going to kill him, shoot him dead. And generally, Conrad would never answer any calls from Johann whenever they were together, when Ina and Johann were together. So when Conrad got a call from his mother, he obviously thought it was his mother. But on the other end of the phone was Johann, and he said, "You better come to my house now, your mother wants to tell you something important." And he thought this was really weird because he knew how much Ina really disliked Johann. But now that Ina was lying in the bed, she doesn't know what happened to these three men. She was just crying and she couldn't really see from all the tears. But she heard Conrad's motorbike pull up, and this had such an effect on her that she sat up and was like, "Oh no." And she couldn't talk. Remember, her hands were tied and she had duct tape over her, so she couldn't scream to warn Conrad of what was going to happen. But luckily, Conrad always had an uncomfortable feeling about Johann, so he brought a friend with him on the motorbike to Johann's house. And Johann walked out of the bedroom and greeted Conrad on his motorbike and his friend, and he told the friend, like, "Go get something in the garage. You need to help me with something, but you go get it." He then told Conrad to come back in the house, and he would then ask Conrad to help within the house with something. Ina said that she then heard the boys walk into the passageway between the bedroom and like the living room area. She then heard Conrad shout 3 times, "No, uncle, please don't." And this happened 3 times before she then heard 3 gunshots run out in the house. Ina then sat on the bed absolutely sobbing, and at the same time, Conrad's friend walked back into the house with the box that Johann instructed him to get. But his friend didn't walk up to the bedroom and the area where Ina and Conrad were, because he thought that they were kind of having a family discussion and he didn't really want to get involved. So he just sat in the lounge at the bottom of the stairs. He also heard none of the gunshots because he was in the garage at the time. But by the time that the friend actually got back into the house, Johann had left through the back door and he was already in his bakkie fleeing the scene. Johann then phoned the landlord who owned the house, remember? And he tried to phone him, but he wasn't answering. And eventually someone did answer the phone, but it was his wife. So the landlord's wife ended up going to the house to see what Johann was talking about, because Johann was saying that something was wrong with the house. You need to go check it out. So this lady's name was actually Vivian, which was the landlord's wife. So Vivian walks into the house, which she owns, and she sees Conrad's friend sitting on the couch, and she's like, "What's happening?" And he was like, "I don't know. Johann asked me to get something out the garage, but no one's talking, nothing's happening." So as Vivian walks up the stairs and she gets into the hallway, she sees Conrad's body lying in a pool of his own blood. She also then walks into the bedroom and she sees the horrifically gruesome sight of Ina and her body, her mutilations. And the police arrived, the ambulance arrived, and they took Ina. But I think with most sexual assault cases, they need to go to a hospital where they can take evidence from the assault. And Ina really couldn't handle this. She said she didn't want to be with anyone. She just wanted to go to someone she knew, which was their general practitioner. And that's the only like kind of medical person that she wanted to see at the time. So sadly, she did go to the GP, and this GP had never done a sexual assault case before. So he never took any swabs, he never took any DNA, and he never really looked. But he did say that he could see that she had been sexually assaulted and penetrated with an abnormal object, basically. Luckily, the GP did take photos of all the injuries. He did clean her up, and he said that this was one of the most gruesome things that he had ever seen. And police were only allowed to see Ina after a couple of days because she had obviously gone through something very traumatic. But when they did see her, they took down her statement, and she said that there were 3 men who attacked her and Johann Kotze. For some reason, Ina still had been paying Johann's phone bill. So luckily she was, actually, because they ended up checking Johann's phone records, and they noticed that he was constantly in contact with a certain number. And they checked this number, and it belonged to Andries Satole. And the morning of the attack on Ina, they had called each other, Andries and Johann had called each other 41 times. Andries Satole was arrested fairly quickly after they found this evidence, and he also gave up the names of the 2 other men that were involved in the crime. And during this time, the men, or the 3 accomplices of Johann's crime, were constantly saying that they were being forced to do this by Johann. They were held up by gunpoint by him, so it was not their choice. But a large manhunt was taken up for Johann. There was also an SMS campaign that was sent out to those in the area. But eventually the police did find him. They actually found him in some bushes that were behind the B&B or the place that he was renting. So he was literally in the same area the whole time. And in these bushes, they found his bakkie, they found food, clothing, bedding, and also a whole lot of letters. And during the entire time that Ina was busy recovering, he was writing letters to her, claiming still that it's her fault. She was the one who did this to herself. Basically, he was victim bashing her completely. So now the police had found Johann within these bushes, and he had quite a few scratches and bruises on him. So they took him to the GP to get fixed up. And the GP did notice that Johann was fine. He was showing no displays of any mental haziness. He was completely clear. He had a clear mind. He was responsive, and the GP noted that to the police. Now, with all the men in custody, all the men were charged with 1 count of murder for Conrad, 1 count of attempted murder for Ina, and kidnapping and rape. On the same day that Johann had first appeared in court, he was actually let go because of insufficient evidence. And also the same day that Johann was in trial, Conrad was laid to rest. And literally after a day of trial, Johann Kotze was free to walk on the streets. And people were saying that when he went to friends' brides, his friends believed him, and Johann would go around bragging about it. It was just a story that he was telling people. It wasn't so horrific. He didn't show any remorse for anything. So as we see with a lot of maybe celeb cases or massive sports stars, once sometimes women have someone who has come out before, or people, it doesn't only have to be women, once someone has come out before about their traumatic event or sexual assault, sometimes victims maybe feel brave or secure in coming out with their stories. And this is what happened with Johann. So once Ina had gone through everything and she had such horrific injuries, women actually started coming out of the woodworks about what Johann had done to them as well. These women who were attacked by Johann also said that he was incredibly cruel. He had also was very manipulative, so he would be all nice, but then all of a sudden he would flip. Now remember I said to you, Johann, while Ina was being attacked, he said to her, quote, "When he left a woman, she either ended up committing suicide or in a mental institution." End quote. Well, basically this was true. This did happen to one of the girls that he dated. He had dated another lady just before Ina, who was a successful businesswoman. She was wealthy and she was beautiful. Her name was Sarita, and they ended up dating, and they once went to a holiday in Mozambique. So Sarita had quite a bad medical condition at the time where she constantly had to wear oxygen from one of those pipes that you put in your nose, and she had to have that constantly because apparently she had a brain tumor that required her to have extra oxygen all the time. And Johann knew this. Medical aid was completely paying full price for everything that Sarita was having because they knew that she needed this for her life. So while Johann and Sarita were in Mozambique, he asked Sarita just to take the pipe off for a photo so that they could take it in the back of their Jeep, just so that it could look normal. Then when they returned from holiday, Johann said to Sarita, "I need money, you need to give it to me now." And Sarita was like, "No, I'm not just giving you money." And Johann said, "Oh, is it? Because if you don't give me the money, I'm going to take that photo that we took in Mozambique and send it to the medical aid to show that you're a liar." And Sarita was like, "No, you won't, because that would be a lie. I do need the oxygen." And Sarita didn't end up giving Johann the money. Literally, Johann went to the medical aid and showed the picture of Sarita and Johann, and they stopped paying everything for Sarita and told her to pay for the backlog of everything that they've paid so far. And Sarita was horrified by this because she really did need the oxygen to survive. And that was millions of rands that she would have to pay back. And funny enough, but when Johann was busy dating Sarita, he asked a friend of his to get divorcees or widows numbers. He wanted their numbers, and that's how he met Ina, apparently, was that his friend had given him her number. And the reason for this, Johann said, was because he wanted to help them with their finances now that they're alone. They don't know how to manage money by themselves. Then while Ina and Johann were talking, he was still dating Sarita. And Sarita actually found out that Johann was cheating on her, and she phoned Ina to warn her. But Ina was kind of told by Johann that she was just a jealous ex-girlfriend and she must ignore it. So Ina did. Sadly, a month after Ina and Johann started dating, Sarita took her own life. There were also another 5 women that came forward from Bloemfontein, where Johann stayed before, who said that he owed them at least 1.3 million rand in money that he had just taken from them. But eventually the state put together enough evidence to take Johann and his 3 accomplices back to court. Johann pleaded not guilty, and he demanded that a psychiatric test be done on him because he deemed himself mentally incapable to handle the trial. and there was a psychiatric test done on him and he was deemed fit to enter trial. The trial started with Ina talking about her incredibly horrific story. The detail of Ina's story was also so graphic that the judge said that no one could talk about it outside of court. And sadly, when there was a cross-examination and the defense had to now defend Johann, they came in with the whole reason that Ina was at fault, and this is what the defense was going to go on. The defense called Ina a liar. They also brought all of the injuries that Ina had suffered and said that this was all false. She could have done it to herself because apparently the GP did not record them properly. The men also who were busy defending Johann said that she also kind of deserved it because she was cheating and that she had driven Johann to insanity by constantly cheating on him, and that's why he did it. Johann also said that Ina was never raped by him because there was no DNA found anywhere on her body. Yeah, there was no DNA because you burnt her and you put like things inside her, so don't even. Yeah. Ina was painted in an incredibly horrible light during this entire trial. They would indicate that she was a loose woman, which is just terrible, and that is kind of the narrative that the defense went on all the time. And this is what I find so frustrating in cases like this, or gender-based violence kind of cases, where people start victim shaming. And when Johann was put into the jail because he was denied bail, people in Modimolle for some reason thought that it was okay to completely shame Ina. And remember, she was free, so she could walk the streets, and people were constantly shouting names at her and calling her really mean words. Ina also started getting threatening messages. People would rock up at her door. And an attorney who was completely unrelated to the case, he wasn't even working on Johann's defense or Ina's, tweeted that Ina was actually getting what she deserved, because this is a lesson to all women, that they couldn't just treat men how they wanted to treat them and actually think that they could get away with it. So obviously this attorney was fired, and rightly so. Wow. Facebook groups were also formed against Ina and for Johann. And during the whole trial, the three accomplices constantly insisted that they were being forced to do everything by Johann. And during the trial, it had to come out that Andries Sitole was actually HIV positive. He didn't want this coming out in trial because he didn't want it to have a bad reputation on his name. And apparently, Andries said that he only found out for the first time during trial that he was HIV positive. But the state didn't believe that Andries was only finding out for the first time during trial. And the whole reason that there was an attempted murder charge on Andries for Ina was because they believed that he knew that he was HIV positive. And in South Africa, I think that you can get attempted murder for knowingly having sex with someone unprotected when you have HIV. And the state believed that Andries and Johann had made this pact together where they would sexually assault Ina, and Andries would then give her HIV to ruin her life even more. Apparently, this is what they thought. So during the trial, Johann completely tried to only plead insanity, and it was working for a certain time until the tide started turning and more evidence came out, and Johann was looking worse and worse. And eventually he became aggressive and angry and just really ugly towards everyone in the trial. Eventually he said that he had done all of this because Ina had actually cheated on him, apparently according to Johann, and he was just getting her back for what she had done to him. And the reason that he asked Ina to come to the house was because he thought that they were actually going to reconcile and they were going to get back together. But then when Ina came there and she started talking about divorce, Johann and Ina started getting angry at each other, and then Johann said that Ina then got angry at him and threw a vibrator at his face, and that's why he did what he did, because she deserved it. The things that this man actually says is horrific. Johann was also questioned during trial why he didn't try and help Ina if supposedly he didn't have any involvement in it, why he didn't help Ina with the three men who were sexually assaulting her. And he said because Andries and the other two men were so powerful that he couldn't overpower them. But then just as things were kind of looking up for Ina, a psychologist was asked to come onto the stand because Johann had switched lawyers, and he said that the lawyer was lying and saying things about Johann. So they had to do a psychiatric test again. I don't know why, but they did. And a psychologist came onto the stand and said that she believed everything that Johann said, and that he was at a stage in his mental state during the day that Ina was attacked that he could not be held accountable at all. She said that he was delusional and that he had no recollection, so he was innocent, basically, is what she was saying. And she said that the reason for all of this was that Johann had a narcissistic personality disorder and he didn't understand what he was doing that day. And the prosecution ripped this lady's testimony apart. They were like, how can you actually say that when you haven't even read Ina's side of the testimony? you only read Johann's side, and then you said that because of this he was innocent. They also noticed that Johann and the psychologist were actually writing a book together about Johann's experience of this entire night. And also what they noticed was this lady was known for her long curly hair that she had, and then during the trial of Johann she happened to have very, very short hair. Coincidence? I think not. But after all of this, the judge had had enough, and he said, listen, Johann, I don't believe your side of the story. I actually believe Ina's side of the story. Ina was very, very concise and factual throughout her testimony, and Johann was constantly rambling, mumbling, and then talking down and then coming back up. So the judge wasn't believing his whole insanity act at all. The judge said that there was sufficient evidence to prove that Johann had maliciously intended to hurt Ina, and that he had planned the attack weeks before because he was constantly in contact with Andries. The judge also said that Johann had purposefully attacked her the way he did and not murdered her because Johann wanted Ina to constantly have scars and remember Johann that way, emotionally and physically. For the 3 men who attacked Ina as well, he believed that they all did the sexual assault out of their own free will. Johann Kotze and Andries Sithole were found guilty of all charges against them, except for the attempted murder of Ina Bonet, as this charge rested on the fact that the state believed that Andries actually knew that he was HIV positive before the attack, which they couldn't actually prove. But both men were sentenced to 2 life sentences, as well as an additional 10 years for the kidnapping charges. Peter Malake and Selo Mpaka were acquitted of the murder charge of Conrad Bonet, as they could not really prove that they actually knew that Johann was going to kill Conrad that day. And they were also acquitted of Ina Bonet's attempted murder charge. They weren't sure if these 2 men had left before everything had happened, and they only thought that these men were there for the sexual assault. But for the rape and kidnapping of Ina Bonet, they were sentenced to a life sentence and additional 10 years for kidnapping. So Ina Bonet is still living in Modimolle. She decided not to leave because she wants to rebuild her life, and she currently works as a motivational speaker. Johann Kotze has appealed and has been denied, and many of the Facebook pages that were actually supporting Johann have been taken down by Facebook. But there is still one page which is private and is run by his sister in the support that Johann is still innocent. So that is the case of the Modimolle Monster, and I definitely think that he deserves that title. You could also maybe have a few other really harsh names thrown at him, but we'll keep it PG. I remember hearing about this case a long time ago. I was in matric when this happened, so I'm telling my age here. But I remember it being quite a hectic case and horrific to hear. And I'm quite happy that Johann and all the 3 accomplices are behind bars. I do get upset when people use other people for their own dirty work. However, these men had ample opportunity to leave. They didn't have to get in the bucket. They could have left as soon as Johann started being really aggressive towards Ina. And Johann wouldn't, I don't know what he would have done, but I doubt that he would have chased them. Yeah, like I said, that is the story of the Modimolle Monster. I hope you were entertained by this case, and I hope that you are staying safe out there. Definitely be safe out there. Yeah, and I will see you next week. Bye.